Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just about a minute or so. Hello. We'll get started in a minute. Oh, Gary, I appreciate the challenge you face. Talmud, Giants, Dodgers. So, especially as someone from the Bay Area. I mean, I grew up mostly an A's fan. I grew up mostly in Oakland. Um, but, so yes, Southern California, baseball versus Talmud. Though I'm sure if we spend enough time, we could talk about the connections and the similarities and the overlap between Judaism and baseball for another time, another session for sure. Hi everyone, thank you for being here on this Thursday. I'm glad it's a little cooler here in LA this week. All right, Gary, I remember you mentioning you were up there in the Bay Area for a while. So, okay. Hello, good afternoon, happy Thursday for our 23rd session together of Talmud Tales. Sometimes I feel like I'm going to run out of stories, but it never ends. There are so many. So today we are going to delve into the concept of a balancing act between personal and professional responsibilities, and there are a few other themes that we'll get to as well. So we'll get to that in a moment. Just to clarify, as I always do at the beginning of these sessions, our Zoom protocol. We'll go through this. I'll read through it once, then we'll go back and I'll explain some of the pieces and give some thoughts, and then I'll open it up, of course, to all of you to share your own thoughts and perspectives. And so you can either virtually raise your hand, add something to the chat, or put something in the Q&A for me to look at. All right. So let's begin, as we always do, with the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Feel free to join with me. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who commands us to engage in the study of Torah. All right, here we go. Okay, as I mentioned, we are looking at this week, actually, at two stories. They come back to back. And we have actually explored some of the other stories in this specific section of Ketubot, the section of Talmud called Ketubot. We've actually studied a few of the stories from this section before. And these are the last two in this set of basically 7 stories that talk about rabbis who are torn between their love and their obligation to study Torah and their home responsibilities, mostly when it comes to their relationship with their wives. And so we've talked about some of these before. One who came home, and as soon as he came home, actually this was just a couple weeks ago, where he was worried that his wife was going to die. There's one reference to a story of as soon as this rabbi shows up in his home after years of being away, 12 or 13 years away, his wife sees him when he enters the house and she dies, and he prays for her to return, and she does. But there is this theme that continues throughout this section of Ketubot, all about what does it mean to look for balance. And so what I wanted us to do today is to finish up that section with the 2 final stories. They're all pretty short stories, but the 2 final stories of this section that have to do with this balancing act, and for us to think about as we're moving into the fall, which for me always feels like more of when balancing really comes into play, where people are really kind of gearing up after the summer. And yes, we've been at home most of the summer, but I still think there is a shift in mentality that occurs when we get into the fall. And maybe that's the school calendar, or maybe it's the fact that the Jewish holidays begin in the fall, and that really kicks off the year of re-engagement in the Jewish community. Whatever it may be, this is the time, and especially since we're in the month of Elul, this is the time where we're supposed to be preparing ourselves for the high holidays. And really, if you think about the high holidays, it is about a balancing act. It's about balancing our day-to-day responsibilities with our goals for our life, where we can find deeper purpose and meaning? And how do we balance those two when at some points they may feel as though they are in contrast to one another? So how can we look for more balance? And the high holidays is a time, and especially now leading up to it, where we're supposed to be really thinking about that. So that's what I want us to think about today. So we're going to go through these two stories. They're in addition to this idea of the balancing act between personal and professional. And I want you to try and understand, well, what do you think the rabbis and the Talmud are teaching us about that balancing act? Are they giving us a formula that allows us to be successful at that? Are they not? What are they doing with that? The first of the two stories also discusses a lot about the role of the partner. Now, of course, in the Talmud, it's usually the wife. But really, I think you can see this in a more modern understanding. What does it mean to be in a partnership with someone else? And what role do they play in helping or alleviating the burden of that balance between professional and personal life? And what role should they play, or do they play? So there's some of that, as we'll see in terms of Rabbi Akiva's wife. And in the second story, I think there's another element about this work-life balance, but could also be just a whole complete subject on its own, which is the role of parenting in deciding the priorities and responsibilities and trajectory of children. What role does a parent have? What obligations do they have? Or what do you think are the roles and responsibilities of a parent in terms of how you help to guide a child, whether grown or a young child, towards their priorities and how they prioritize their time? So there seems to be some familial challenges that exist in the second story that we'll look at. So actually a lot of themes that we find in just these two short stories. So let's go through it and be thinking about all of these things. Of course, always think about how you relate to these things and how we might apply them in our world today. And we'll go through them, and then we'll open it up, of course, for conversation. All right, so let's get to it. As I said, we're in Ketubot. We've studied this section before. This spans the end of 62b and the beginning of 63a. And this first story that we're going to look at is the story of Rabbi Akiva, of course, a very famous rabbi who is not just the Joe Schmo rabbi. This is not just a rabbi or someone who is studying Torah. This is a teacher of teachers, a master scholar. And so we have to be thinking about, is this story supposed to be the rule and try and teach us what is the balance, or is this trying to be the exception to the rule? And so the stories that we have looked at before, and maybe the one that comes right after this, are supposed to help remind us that Rabbi Akiva is the exception and not something we should go after, because we are not Rabbi Akiva. We are not like Moses. We are not these Talmid Chachamim, these really learned rabbis. So is it an exception to the rule or the rule itself? Okay, so Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was the shepherd of Ben Kalba Savua. His daughter saw that he was modest and noble. She said to him, "If I become betrothed to you, will you go to the house of study?" He said to her, "Yes." She became betrothed to him secretly and sent him off. Her father heard and drove her out of his house and forbade her from benefiting from his property. He went and remained at the academy for 12 years. When he came back, he brought with him 12,000 disciples. He heard a sage say to her, "How long are you going to lead a life of a lifelong widow?" She said to him, "If he should pay attention to me, he would spend another 12 years in study." He said, "So what I'm doing is with permission." He went back and stayed at the academy another 12 years. When he came back, he brought with him 24,000 disciples. His wife heard and went out to meet him. Her neighbors said to her, "Borrow some nice clothes and put them on." She said to him, "A righteous man knows the life of his beast." When she came to him, she fell on her face and kissed his feet. His attendants pushed her away. He said to them, "Leave her alone. What is mine and what is yours is hers." Her father heard that an eminent authority had come to town. He said, "I shall go to him. Maybe he'll release me from my vow." He came to him. He said to him, "Did you take your vow knowing that your daughter would marry a great man?" He said to him, "Even if he had known a single chapter, even if he had known a single law, I would have never taken that vow." He said to him, "I am the man." He fell on his face and kissed his feet and gave him half of his property. The daughter of Rabbi Akiva did the same thing with Ben Azai, and that is in line with what people say. You follows you. A daughter's acts are like those of her mother. second story, but falls right after that one. Rabbi Yosef ben Rava was sent by his father to the academy of Rabbi Yosef ben Chia. They, the family, agreed to support him financially for 6 years. When he had been there 3 years, as the eve of Yom Kippur approached, he said, "I'll go and see my family." His father heard about it. He took an axe and went to meet him, saying to him, "Did you remember your whore?" There are those who say, he said to him, "Did you remember your dove?" They quarreled, and neither one ate a final meal prior to the fast. The end. Okay. All right. So now we're going to go back and try and understand what's going on here. In the first story, we have the characters of Rabbi Akiva, his wife. Her name's Rachel, even though we don't hear her name here. We hear it in other places. We have Rachel's father, Rabbi Akiva's father-in-law. Those are the characters in the first story. Second story, we have a rabbi who goes away to study and his father. Okay. And so now we're going to go back, and for the first one, what is the role that Rabbi Akiva's wife is playing here? What is the tradition trying to teach us about the role of a partner in helping to find that work-life balance? Or is this story not about work-life balance at all, and instead about something else? Is this about what it takes to support another person in their own endeavors? I don't know. You be the judge. So we'll hear your thoughts in a minute, but let's go back and start delving into this again. Okay, Rabbi Akiva, up until this point, historically speaking, Rabbi Akiva came into learning Torah having known nothing. So he came straight from being a shepherd. The whole idea was that potentially he was 40 years old, whatever it may be. He's someone who did not grow up studying Torah, but now he was a shepherd, and this man, Ben Kalva Savua, his daughter sees Rabbi Akiva as a nice man and says, "If I become betrothed to you, will you go to the house of study?" It's almost as if she sees some potential in him. We don't know what the potential is, but already we have here. Can you think about those people that you've come across in your life who, even if they're doing something that maybe, I don't know, you don't know too much about, or it's not in your wheelhouse, and yet you see something within them, even if they live in a world very different from your own, because we can imagine here that Rachel lives in a different world than Akiva, and yet there's something there that she sees. She sees some potential, right? So I think already in the beginning of the story, we have the idea and the recognition that sometimes you can find the potential in someone without them coming out and articulating it, but that part of our responsibility of being a good partner, as is the case here before she is even technically his partner, is to recognize that a partner is someone who we see potential in and that we want to help support that potential, right? As she does here, because she's saying to him, "I see some potential in you. I want you to go and study." Okay? And he says, "Yes, I will go do that if you want to be with me." So she became betrothed to him secretly and sent him off to go and study. And her father hears about this and drives her out of the house and forbids her from benefiting from her property. In other words, he cuts her off. He says, "You married this schlubby guy who's a shepherd. We are of an established family. You have it. I am vowing," basically this is why the vow comes back into play later on in the story, "you will have nothing of mine." So now she is destitute, in poverty, doesn't have any of the support of her family. She's cut off from her family because she saw something and she decided she wanted to be with Akiva. And so she's left alone. And he went and he remained at the academy for 12 years. And this is, we've seen 12 years, we've seen 13 years. The idea, and throughout the stories of this section, are all about rabbis who go off for long periods of time to study. And the struggle that the rabbis are having as they're talking and teaching us these stories about, is that a good thing or a bad thing, right? Torah is seen as so central, and it is a livelihood, even though a lot of rabbis also had other professions. But at the same time, we also have built into our tradition the centrality of the family and of the home. And as we've looked at other stories, and if we even think about last week's Torah portion, where we looked at Shoftim and the idea that when you're in war, that there are certain people who are forbidden to go to battle. that they actually have to go home and not go into battle because they have a fiance who they haven't married yet. They have a home that they haven't really put up the mezuzah on, so to speak, whatever it may be. So there is a centrality of home. So these two things are at odds. So he goes there for 12 years, and when he comes back, he brings 12,000 disciples. Already we get the sense that Akiva is a very learned man and clearly very successful in what he does as a teacher and as a rabbi. And he heard someone say to his wife, how long are you going to lead a life of a lifelong widow? In other words, how long are you going to be sitting here as if your husband doesn't exist? He's been gone for 12 years, and are you willing to just sit around in poverty while your husband is off, who knows what he's doing? It's as if you're not even married, or that your husband is dead because you never see him. Her answer is, if he should pay attention to me, he would spend another 12 years in study. She is so passionate about supporting him that she is willing to say, you know what? I actually think the way he's going, he should go study for another 12 years because that's how much I want him to go and be studying. So he said, so what I'm doing is with permission. Now this is Rabbi Akiva either hearing directly or hearing about his wife saying that if she had her way, he'd go and study for another 12 years. So he goes back and stays at the academy for another 12 years, 24 years away from his family and his wife at this point. And we don't actually know, did he say anything to her? Did he interact with her? Or did he just hear that she said he should study for another 12 years? So he goes back and studies for another 12 years without even engaging with her or seeing her. We don't know. When he came back after another 12 years, he brought with him 24,000 disciples. He's now even more successful as a rabbi, a learned scholar. His wife heard and went out to meet him. And her neighbor said to her, borrow some nice clothes and put them on. Because remember, she's been poor for the last 24 years, alone, without her support system. She was cut off from her family, and her husband's been off studying. And she responds to this idea of, go borrow some nice clothes and put them on. She says, no, a righteous man knows the life of his beast. Okay, what does that mean? Is she calling herself a beast here? Now, if you look at Proverbs 12 is contrasting good versus wicked people. And it's going through a variety of ways in which if good people do this, the wicked do that. So this is one of those verses where this is actually just half of the verse. A righteous man knows the life of his beast, and the wicked knows it through wickedness. I don't actually remember. I looked it up earlier, but I don't remember off the top of my head. You can go look it up yourself. But it's a contrast between good and bad. So here she's saying a righteous man knows the life of his beast. Now you imagine, what is the life of a beast? It is the life of the working animal that works on behalf of the person. That someone who is a good person recognizes and understands what it means to be a working beast or animal on the behalf of this person, right? We have a dog, for example. The dog knows our love, and we have a responsibility as owners to show our love and appreciation for the dog. And the dog is going to honor us and to do what we say because we have a relationship that you understand as much as you can understand animals, that you have a way in which you respect what the animal is doing for you by working for you. That seems to be what this is getting at. In other words, she's saying, he knows that I am here to support him and be by his side and to serve him. And therefore, it doesn't matter what I'm wearing. Because what really matters is that he knows deep down that I've been doing what I'm doing because I want him to be successful, and I'm here to support him. Now, of course, there are a lot of gender things we could play into here. We have to remember the context of this time period. But there is this theme of sacrifice and the theme of being there to support someone else. And I think this is a really important theme that we find in this story. What does it mean for us to be in that supportive role? And a lot of the times, traditionally, women are in the supportive role of men, even today, when it comes to work-life balance, and that the men go out and work and the women take care of the home. And so this seems to be really about how do we understand the role of serving someone else, not for the benefit of recognition, because a beast doesn't necessarily get recognition. It just serves its master. What is the role of service without recognition or reward? In our society today, that is not something that is illuminated. That's not something that we put on a pedestal. We usually tend to live in a world in which you serve in order to get recognition or reward. But here, this is talking about there are certain parts of relationship that we are supposed to have with someone who we love, where we are serving them and sacrificing pieces of ourselves in order for them to be as successful as possible. And that can be really hard to do, but our tradition seems to be suggesting here, whether you want to keep it specifically in a gender role that women are supposed to support the men, or if you want to take a more egalitarian approach, that this text is saying we each, in any deep relationship that you have with someone else, you have almost an obligation, if not an opportunity, to serve that person and their needs in order for them to be successful. And sometimes that means you need to sacrifice pieces of yourself in order to support the other person. Right? And so you can be thinking about in your own life and in your own relationships, have there been times where you have sacrificed certain things in order for the benefit of your partner? Has your partner done the same for you? Is there a balance there or not? If not, is it something worth addressing? So this seems to be talking about that work-life balance requires some kind of sacrifice. Whether or not there is any work-life balance here is a different story. But the challenge that exists, according to right this little piece, is this idea of how much are we willing to give up of ourselves in order to help someone else who we care about, in order for them to be successful, however that is to be defined. Okay? So I'm curious your thoughts on that as we get towards the end. When she came out, she fell on her face and kissed his feet. She hasn't seen him for a long time, and his attendants pushed her away. It's as if they don't know who she is, and she's not worthy of coming and getting close to him. And yet he said to them, leave her alone. What is mine and what is yours is hers. In other words, all of this, everything the fact that you, my disciples, are here, the fact that I am here, the fact that I am successful, all of these things are the result of her. He's putting all of it on her, that her sacrifice allowed him to be successful, and that all of it should be given over as her responsibility and her doing. Now, her father heard that there was an eminent authority had come to town, and he said, I shall go and see him, because maybe he's going to release me from my vow. Maybe he will allow me some way to support my daughter, because I don't know if her husband's ever going to come back again. But I'm stuck in this place. I made this vow that she's cut off from my family, and you can imagine there's some guilt there. And we can also then now take this as a link to those of us who are parents, or those of us who have been in this situation as children. Have there been those moments where you have felt cut off from your family or members of your family, whether that has been verbally dictated and you have literally been cut off from your family, or if it's an emotional process in which you felt cut off? And here there seems to be a recognition of wanting to do something about that after years of sitting in that divisiveness within the family, that there is this yearning that this father has to reconnect. But according to law and the idea of a vow, he needs to figure out a way to get out of this vow. And so he goes to this man. He doesn't know who he is yet. Did you take your vow knowing that your daughter would marry a great man? Did you know who she was marrying? And did you take this knowing exactly who she was marrying? And he said, even if he had known a single chapter, even if he had known a single law, I would have never taken that vow. Because Rabbi Akiva didn't know anything, and this father misread the Rabbi Akiva and assumed that he was nothing, he made this vow. But if he had had any inkling that this man could have been successful, he would have never cut off his daughter. He would have never made that vow. And so he said to him, I am that man. It's like the big reveal. He says, I am the one. All right? You can imagine it in a movie scene. And he fell on his face and he kissed his feet. In other words, the father now fell at his son-in-law's feet and gave him half of his property. Right? And now gives him all the wealth and reward. And the daughter of Rabbi Akiva did the same with Ben Azai. And that is in line with what people say. You follows you. A daughter's acts are like those of her mother's. Rabbi Akiva's daughter did the same thing later on down the line, did the same thing with with Ben Azai. In other words, there is a lineage that comes, that when you have someone in your family, in this case a woman, who is willing to sacrifice and willing to give up so much in order to support the family or support her husband, that is something that gets passed down. We can also take this as there are lots of things that get passed down from generation to generation, both positive and negative things, because it's not really clear from the story, even though we tend to read this as this is a positive ending, right? All is happy at the end. We can't gloss over the fact that there were 24 years of pain and who knows what else that Rabbi Akiva's wife was going through. And everyone in this family, the father clearly was in pain. Rabbi Akiva, we don't know his emotional state. Yes, he was getting all these disciples, but as he says when he's reunited with his wife, this is all because of her. So that's story one. Okay, so lots of different pieces there. Now let's just go quickly to story two. It's a lot shorter. We have another story of a rabbi who was sent by his father to the academy. So now it's not that his wife is sending him, but his father is sending him to the academy. He wants to do good by his father. And the families agreed that they were going to support him for 6 years, so that he could go for 6 years. This is now, you can see, half the amount of time that Rabbi Akiva went away, each of the times that he went away. But when he had been there 3 years, as the eve of Yom Kippur approached, he said, I'm going to go and see my family. We can assume now that his family he's also married. Okay, the assumption built into the story is that when he goes home to see his family, he's going home to see a wife who he left, in addition to the rest of his family. I'm going to go and see my family. And his father heard about it. He took an axe and goes out to meet him, saying to him, did you remember your whore? In other words, you came back early with such anger and resentment and disappointment. He comes out with this axe, destructive imagery, to meet him and said, did you remember your whore? In other words, in the Hebrew, zonatcha, your zonah is the Hebrew word for that. And there are others who say, he said to him, did you remember your dove, yonatcha? Totally different way of understanding that's the story based on which one you go with. He either comes out and says something negative, or he comes back and he says, he still goes out with the axe, we assume. Did you remember your dove? In other words, either way, it's him confronting his son, but there are two very different ways of understanding it, and it's interesting that the rabbis include both. Why would the rabbis include both? Why not just one or the other, right? And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. And they quarreled, and neither one ate a final meal prior to the fast. So father and son sit there on the eve of Yom Kippur, right before Yom Kippur is supposed to start, before they're going to go to listen to Kol Nidre and spend the next 25 hours deep in contemplation and prayer and thought and tshuva. They fight to the point where they even miss the final meal. They don't even get to have that final meal before the fast together. And so the story ends with that conflict just sitting over the entire story, and really sitting over the entire group of these stories, because at the end there doesn't seem to be a good answer. The rabbis don't leave us with some wonderful, profound way of finding the balance. They leave us hanging. They leave us with no real sense of how we're supposed to do this. They tend to teach us, they seem to be teaching us that there are certain things you shouldn't do, right? You shouldn't be going away for long periods of time. You need to be connected to your family. And that at the end of the day, your connection with those with whom you live in your specific home, and in this case, your partner, that's the most important thing. Then secondarily are your parents, and then everyone else. But at the end of the day, how are you prioritizing your time? And they don't leave us they leave us hanging at the end. So I think a thing that this brings up that I think is really important that we find throughout the Talmud is this lack of resolution. And do you find this lack of resolution comforting or disconcerting? And I think that is something that the rabbis and the Talmud continuously deal with and put us in this position, as is the case with life, and why I think it's so brilliant of the Talmud to leave us hanging in this way, is that we are constantly battling between the comfort of what is known and the discomfort of what is not known. And some people are drawn to the mystery of not having it, laid out for us. And others find that completely disconcerting. And here we are left having to decide the lack of direction that I'm getting overall from these stories. Does that give me comfort in the sense that it gives me the room to make the decision as best I see fit? Or is this troubling because it leaves too many options open for people to neglect certain pieces of their lives in order to fulfill other pieces of their life? So it's up to you. I mean, you're going to respond to that one way or the other, and the Talmud doesn't really guide you in one way or the other. You have to start thinking about how do I, and this is why I think it's really these two stories are great, and the whole set of stories is great, is because it really leaves us there struggling with how we set our own priorities, and how do we find that balance, and can we find that balance? And the rabbis seem to be suggesting with these stories, there's no easy answer. And sometimes you're going to feel like you've had that balance, and other times you're not. And that's just the way it is. A lot of times in the Talmud, the rabbis do not come up with a perfect answer. And sometimes in an argument, they will end an argument by saying teku. In other words, we're done. We don't know where this story is going, or how we're going to end this story, or how we are going to make a decision in this area of law. And so we're just saying done. We're just teku. It's over. We're not coming to any conclusion. We're just going to let it hang there. Right? And that, I think, is a really important lesson for us that has nothing to do necessarily with professional and personal life balance. It has to do with the fact that our tradition is saying there are certain things that we're not going to be able to answer for you and are part of just the journey of going through life and that struggle. And you're going to have to figure it out on your own. Right? It's the same thing we try and teach our children. And yet we have examples in these two stories of parents not necessarily going in that faction and trying to dictate for their children their direction. And the Talmud struggles with that also, because there is this idea that we are supposed to honor our parents. And yet sometimes our parents can get in the way of our progress. So lots of different things to be thinking about here. So thoughts, comments. Let's see what you have here. As Phyllis says, it is what it is. You're right. It is what it is. Isn't it always that way in some ways? Okay. Hi, Merle. What are your thoughts today?
The last line really said it for me, that the journey, you can't force your children to do something, because somewhere along the line it will backfire. And I've seen it with people, my age and their adult children, where they expected them to become some profession and it didn't happen. And to this day, many years later, they're very disturbed that their kids wouldn't follow what they wanted them to do for their life. And I think that's a big imbalance for those people.
Yeah. Great. Yes, it's a real issue. And as someone who, some of you have grown children, I have young children. And so but I assume at all levels of parenting, we are faced with this challenge from the time our children are young to the time even when they are grown up and they have their own families. And we, as we get older, have a perspective and an understanding of the world that they may not have, or we have our own viewpoints and our own life experience that of course plays into how we want to raise our children, but how we want to guide them. And yet we struggle with that. And these stories seem to also indicate this struggle, not just for those on the receiving end as the children, but also giving real time and effort to parents to like this recognition, yeah, your job is tough because you may feel like you want to disown them. And then you might realize later on that you wish you hadn't done that, and the struggle that may come with that. Or what does it mean to really have certain expectations and believe, just like Rachel believed in her husband Akiva, believe that there is potential there, and not to see that potential come to reality. And how do you sit with that as a parent? And the challenge that we have in the second story of the father who is so enraged by the lack that his son is not living up to the father's perception of that son's potential, or is not living along the priorities that the father believes in, that he comes with an axe in such a destructive way to feel as though he can't let this happen. right? And so there's a lot in here about what does it mean as a parent to find balance between letting our children find their path and at the same time wanting to use our own wisdom and our own life experience and our own view of the world to help guide them to be successful. In neither of these cases of these stories are the parents out to destroy their children. In fact, they're doing everything they can to try and support them in the way they see it. But the stories seem to show that even we as parents can sometimes have those blinders where we're not really, we're finding our path, but is that the same path as our children? And that's a real struggle here. Great, thank you. Susan. Hi, Susan. Nope. Well, yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Okay, I have, for two parts for stories. I'm glad you mentioned he was like a superstar, which we knew, but actually like Moses. How did he have children? If he just came back was it just really active that one day he came back after 12 years? And then he has a daughter at the end. And how did the children feel about this? Mother was supportive. But then the other thing, he's totally ignoring other rules in the Talmud, probably became later, about the requirements of a husband to have sex with his wife, depending on his profession. So
and that's actually the start. That Susan, that's the Mishnah. You actually mentioned this Mishnah last week, yeah. I think. That's the Mishnah that starts off this entire section of these 7 stories. Is the Mishnah that a Torah scholar is required to have sex with his wife daily, a camel driver once every 3 months, a sailor once every 6 months. There's a variety of things based on your profession, how often you are obligated to pleasure and have sex with your wife. And so that's actually the frame of all of these stories.
Okay, so good. So that was it. But you were saying he was a super rabbi, and comparing him to Moses now makes sense to me, because Moses was criticized by his sister for one of the interpretations for not paying attention to her, and Yitro too said, stop doing everything, appoint judges, which also might have been pay some attention to your wife, my daughter, and the grandkids. So, and we could see it in contemporary society with politicians, senators, presidents senators who have to leave their family at home. That I have a question though. Well, besides, how did he get a daughter once in 24 years? Then I don't get the whore and the dove. And in the second story, we're assuming he was married, but it doesn't say or betrothed that. And so does the whore refer to leaving your studies, or to just to have sex with a woman of the street, and dove meaning the studies, or do they are real people?
Okay, great. Yes, I think we're supposed to assume in the second story that the young rabbi is married and that he's coming back to be with his family, meaning his wife and his extended family. And I think what we're seeing with, because it's kind of a play on the Hebrew, because they're very similar. Zonotcha Yonah. Yonah means dove in Hebrew. So your dove is, there are 2 ways of reading how this father is reacting to the son coming home. He can either say, "Are you coming home?" and he has a salty approach to his son's wife. He doesn't like her. He calls her a whore, clearly. Or does he say, "You're dove," in other words, that you're coming back to who you love? And does that change the story? Is that a way of suggesting that the rabbis are split by saying, well, maybe the story is different depending on how the father is understanding his daughter-in-law? Is it a dove, or is she a whore, one way or the other? Or one interpretation I saw is that it's actually that the son calls her Mayonotcha, and my dove, and the father calls her your whore. So in either way, I don't know exactly what they're going for at the end of the day, but I think it's to show two roads and two paths. And at the end of the day, actually, it doesn't really matter because they still end up not having a meal. They go into Yom Kippur, they go into the most important day of the year, having not come to terms and come to peace with one another, and how problematic that is. And that's the end of the story, of all 7 of the stories in this section. And so they're ending on this pretty negative place that all of these things don't lead. If you're putting one above the other, in other words, I think if you're putting your professional goals above your family, it doesn't end well. And that's how the story ends, is not a positive ending at all. You're going into the most holy day malnourished because you didn't have your final meal, and malnourished in your identity because you're at odds with your family, which of course you're not supposed to go into Yom Kippur. You're supposed to have worked all that out going into Yom Kippur, not afterwards. So that we're left really uncomfortable, and that's a real problem that we face. And it's almost as if it's built in that there is no real solution to this. You are going to end up feeling uncomfortable at one point or another because there's no easy answer to this challenge of your different obligations in the world. So I hope that helps. Thank you, Susan. Hi, Esther. Glad you made it.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed this story I shared with you. I read it early on and I was completely lost. And now I really have what I think is a really nice understanding of what's happening. And I wanted to just offer 2 thoughts. One, I wrote down, it's all a struggle, because I feel like as a working parent myself, I feel like half the time, I'm darned if I do, I'm darned if I don't, in terms of the work-life balance. And so I do feel like over the years, I have tried to make more and more peace with being uncomfortable, because I feel like that's the only way to move forward. I mean, we can't all be doing everything that we want to or need to all at the same time. And so to me, some of that peace, some of the maturity comes with understanding that it's all going to be a struggle and that we're all doing, the best that we can. And the other observation I wanted to share was that somebody once told me, I was interviewing prominent women CEOs. And one of them said to me, this whole idea of work-life balance is a myth. I don't strive for balance, I strive for resilience. And it always stuck with me. I wasn't married at the time, I didn't have children at the time, and I come back to that over and over, and especially today, and with this story, I realized that, we're all subject to what our parents want for us and put out there, what we put on ourselves in terms of what our occupation is, what that means to us. That was a great video that you shared this morning. I really enjoyed that. And I think that, on the eve of Yom Kippur and, every night I lay my head on the pillow, I'm really asking myself the question, am I doing everything I can do? And so I think the story really shows the conflicts, and I take from it that it is always going to be a struggle, but that resilience, believing in the people that we see potential in and doing what we can to nourish that is what's important.
Amen. Thank you, Esther. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I think, again, I feel like there's so many gender things that have come up over many of these sessions. I think as I was listening to Esther, and my wife shared with me some comic that she had found on Facebook, really the challenge that women face of this balance and the struggle that happens. And the comic that she shared was the fact that even though more and more men these days are really involved in their children's lives and are co-parenting in a way that didn't exist necessarily a few generations ago, that there's still an extra burden that seems to fall on the mothers and on the women to hold a lot of information and long-term memory about the children, about the family in a way that the men don't necessarily do. So I would have to get that comic and go into it in more detail. But the challenge, I think, that also this story is raising, that the women in these stories face certain burdens that the men don't, and that at least more overt burdens than the men, who seem to have a very clear place where they are supposed to do this or that, but that the women are left sitting or being identified either as a whore or a dove, or in Rabbi Akiva's wife's case, the things that the burdens that she has to take on that are not of her doing per se, or because of her husband. In other words, she marries this guy, and as a result of just that act, she's cut off. Or the fact that she has to sacrifice these years of her life and live in abject poverty in order to support him. You know, there are all these things that are built into this that I do think even today are issues, just as Esther mentioned, the women CEOs, and this idea of resilience, that there is a resilience that women have to face, and certain challenges that aren't addressed as much in a male world. So thank you for bringing that up, Esther. All right, any other thoughts? No? Okay, wow. All right, well, we did pretty well. Oh, okay. Of course, Jeff. I was surprised you hadn't raised your hand yet, Jeff.
I had, but apparently it didn't go through, so I'm sorry. A couple of things, certainly many points have been raised on both of these stories. And the first one is we have no definition that this betrothal was actually a marriage. The fact that in ancient times, the father of an unmarried woman could totally disavow any vows that she had made and nullify them. We don't know that that existed or that a marriage was consummated. The second thought was all of these people who, in essence, go to yeshiva to study for years and years are really avoiding the one commandment that relates to family, which is be fruitful and multiply. They are ignoring that responsibility, it seems, because we don't have any reference to that in these stories. And the third thing is what was mentioned about the incompleteness, the lack of a resolution in these stories, which does a very positive thing, which creates tension within the reader, to be forced to look at your own beliefs that relate to the facts of the story and to grow in a direction that relates to the amount of tension that the story develops in the individual. Their understanding of this story, their lack of understanding, and what they do to create their own ending to the story. The idea that, the tension that's created by all our acts either moves us forwards or backwards, but we have to look at it, feel that tension, and define the future for ourselves.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Merle. Did you want to say something else, Merle?
Yeah, I have to unmute. Okay. So not to dispute what Jeff said about they're neglecting their responsibility to procreate. We have family who are very Orthodox, who happen to live in Israel, and he does nothing but study all day and all night. She works 2 jobs, and they have 5 kids. So I think that part of their studying reminds them that this is their responsibility. And that, so it doesn't seem to stop them. I'm not sure, what time of day they managed to fit that in, but but it happens. And they're very happy. I mean, they don't have much money. They have enough money to put clothes on the kids. And I think that her father's an Orthodox rabbi in the States, and I think that they also help them out in whatever way they can. But I think a big piece of that too is just like, I don't remember who said it, maybe Susan. Where do you find time over 12 years, 24 years to have children? Right? But in this case, this couple who are young have their 5 kids, and they managed to make it all work somehow.
Yeah, it's amazing what we're capable of doing when we put our minds to something, and what we can balance. I mean, that my next door neighbor has 7 children, Orthodox rabbi. So yes, but I do think the stories are trying to teach us that yes, we can handle a lot, but there's a certain way in which we are supposed to prioritize our time. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't study and dedicate a lot of your time to study, but as we've talked about in prior sessions, that if you're studying Torah, you're supposed to then be able to live out that Torah. If it's only kept in the study hall, in the Beit Midrash, if it's only theoretical, then it's not as useful as when you put it into action. And that, as Jeff mentioned, one of the most important and the earliest mitzvah that we're given is be fruitful and multiply. And that, yes, is about conceiving and creating the next generation, but it's also really about creating a legacy. It's about creating a family unit. It's about creating a home, and that the majority of what happens in Judaism takes place in the home. So if you spend the majority of your time outside the home, then you're not prioritizing in a Jewish way. And yes, we're all at home now. So some could argue, well, now we're all home. But I still think even when we're stuck at home, even more so do we have the responsibility to think about how we are prioritizing our time. Because just being at home doesn't mean you're actually present at home. And I think that on the deeper level, we need to really be spending time right now as we're getting into the fall and into the holidays and into, at least I think about for my own self, it's going to start getting busy again. How am I actually being present in my home? And how can I spend more time in a home-like mentality where my priorities are taken care of and ensuring the success and growth of the people with whom I live? And if you don't live with many people or you live alone, how do you expand that idea and definition of what the home is, and how do you prioritize that above other things? So I think there's still a lot of things in which these stories are teaching us that Torah, in order to truly live the teachings of Torah, you can't do it outside of your home, because the majority of how we are supposed to live out Torah takes place in our home and with the people with whom we interact with on a regular basis. Okay, I want to get to a couple people who haven't saw. David. Hi, David. There are 2 Davids. So David without the last name, you'll go first, and then David Greenseed, you'll be next.
Oh.
Hi.
Hi, thanks, Rabbi. I really enjoy these stories. Rabbi Akiva and his wife, right. We're talking about the first story. Was this the time of war? Why would he want to flee for that long from his wife? And what was studying like back then that they would have to leave? I mean, why couldn't he be with his wife and study, let's say? Or was this an exclusive men's group like we think of, almost like a monastic order or study place where they live and study only men and wives weren't allowed near? Or was also because of this Roman invasion, maybe they were 24,000, it sounds like almost like an army. Was this almost like, it made me think of the, like almost like warriors or something out in battle. And it made me wonder if this was different than we think of just going to a yeshiva or going to a kollel or going to university or college or graduate school or something. I'm trying to figure out what it was that they were doing, That was for the first story. The second story, I also had a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Why don't you ask the other one? And then
I'm sorry,
I'll
were
try
you able
and
to
answer
hear me?
both. Yeah.
Okay. On the second story, I'm wondering, when you asked me the question of the dove and the whore, and that they both are attributed to the father, or they said one might have been the son and one might have been the father. That would make some sense. But if there be 2 separate stories, it has to do with like the symbolic level of how do we relate, or how would we relate to someone? And it does really change the view of the woman in the life, is how you look at the woman, you know? And I'm surprised, though, if the father and the son had such a very different way of looking. I find it kind of shocking. And why would he not want his son to even visit his wife after 3 years? I mean, and it does seem kind of counterintuitive. I don't understand what this commitment was to being away for so long that they're talking about. It just, the whole thing is rather confusing to me.
Great questions. I'll try and answer as many of them as I can. So thank you. So to start with the second one, in terms of the different perceptions of the father and the son, I mean, I think we can look at someone who's officiated weddings and seen different couples and even, you know, friendships. In other words, I think there are clearly sometimes differences between how parents see their in-law children versus the people who actually marry them. So that doesn't surprise me so much. I think the story seems to be clarifying that within one family you can have very different relationships, and people can view those relationships in very different ways. The idea of going away to study was something, not everyone had to go away to study. There were places where there was a yeshiva in the town, but a lot of the times back then there would be, and it wasn't necessarily for those long, you didn't have to go away for that long a period of time, but you would go study with a famous rabbi, or you would want to go to a study hall or a yeshiva or a beit midrash where it is well known for the types of learning that takes place there. And it was only men. And as we've seen in previous stories that we've studied together, the idea of chavruta, of the study partnership, there was an intimacy that existed between people who were studying Torah together that rivaled sometimes the intimacy of a husband and wife. And so people would go away and they'd spend a lot of time living and breathing with their teachers or with their study partners, and they would be spending lots of time just digging into it. And I think in some ways these stories are kind of taking that time and blowing it out of proportion. So I don't know if we should read it literally as 12 years or 6 years. In other words, it's a long period of time away from your home. But to be a rabbi, or to have that learning, remember, this was written by rabbis. So for them, they are going to put their own careers and professions on a pedestal. So, you know, it would be as if I'm saying it took 5 years of rabbinical school. You know, there is nothing more important than becoming a rabbi, and you spend lots of years learning and delving into the intricacies of this tradition. And so it's going to take everything you can, if you want to be a good rabbi, to go and you study as hard as you can. So there's almost also built into this the rabbis writing these stories themselves about themselves. And so you have to also imagine that they're kind of taking their own world into consideration and putting their own lives and what they do for a living as a priority. So I hope that helps a little. And yes, this idea of the warriors, it wasn't necessarily a time of war, but there is a sense, as there always has been, a Jewish insecurity about our survival, and that's been the case forever. And we were in diaspora, especially at the time of the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, written and orated in Babylonia and in exile. We've always had an insecurity about being destroyed, and it's always existed. So built into this idea of all these disciples is the idea that we are strong, we will continue to succeed. Someone like Rabbi Akiva has the power, if you have that many disciples, to continue the tradition and to continue that perspective of the tradition, because as we see throughout all these stories, there are a whole variety of interpretations, and you could have a certain rabbi that you follow. As we've looked at Hillel and Shammai, two different houses of study, two different perspectives. So even within our own tradition, you can follow one line or the other. So those are just a few things, David. I hope that helps a little. Okay, David.
Rabbi, can I just ask one follow through?
Sure.
I was remembering now that the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva, they said died in a plague of some kind, right?
There's a story later about how Rabbi Akiva is martyred, and and some of the challenges later on.
And I'm wondering if some of these stories might be hidden references to the war against the Romans with the Bar Kokhba and all that. And maybe they're using other words like studying, or during the plague, they died of a plague. Maybe they died battling the Romans. You know, I always thought that there's like a hidden language that there might be obscuring what might have been our military history and struggle with the Romans, that they couldn't say it outright because the Romans controlled everything, you know, but
Yeah.
maybe they had some kind of a legacy there that were like, there's a hidden thing of maybe they were not just scholars, but they were scholars and warriors or something back then. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know either. Please do some research and let me know what you find out. I appreciate that. Thanks, David.
Okay.
Okay. David Greenside, how are you? Go ahead, David. If you can unmute.
I'm unmuted. Okay.
Yes.
I'm a member at Peninsula Temple FL. Know your parents.
Oh, hello.
I don't know if your mom's on today.
She probably is. Yes, she is.
So you know, when I hear these stories, I'm always conscious of the fact that there's this tension between the cultural setting in which the story arises, and then as opposed to the eternal issues that human beings have with each other. In this setting, the relationship between father and daughter, and the disrespect that father has for the daughter's choice, you know, in my own life, and I have 2 adult children, and you know, I was very conscious of the fact raising them of the way my parents, you know, at some point stopped listening to me because I was no longer, you know, in their control, and they chose not to grow with me. And I thought how important it would be for me to grow with my children. So, you know, I see the father's arrogance as costing him an enormous amount here. So, you know, I'm wondering why there wasn't a commandment for parents to honor their children as there is for children to honor their parents.
Good question. Good question. My answer would be that, again, just like in the Amidah, the first prayer of the Amidah is Avot Giverot, where we list off Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. That built into how we understand our place in this world is where we come from, not necessarily what's going to come after us, because I think that's more of a mystery than where we have come from. So I think the way I think of it is that in order to really be a successful community and society, you have to honor, not love, because as you pointed out, the commandment is to honor, not to love your parents, but to honor and respect from where you came, just as you were talking about your own parents and how your relationship with your parents led you to create your own relationship and how you wanted to parent your children, right? And there's an honoring, that is about honoring your parents, right? There is something in order for us to be able to move forward and create the next generation, or create a future which is as meaningful and vibrant as possible, we have to take the lessons of what comes from before us. And that our tradition also, there are that honoring your children, I think if you, is just as you talked about the cultural setting versus the eternal, I think from a cultural perspective, children, just like women, were seen as secondary, even though children are seen as the future, and we put a lot of effort into how, in education, if you think about education, that is the way in which we honor. So instead of directly requiring honor your children, we created a whole system of an education system that is supposed to be the way in which we honor our children. And it's by the way we honor our children is by teaching them what we have learned and what our tradition has learned from the past. And if we do that correctly, then we are honoring them. But I think it would be too challenging, especially if you look at certain laws in the Torah, like the rebellious son, which is a story that we find of stoning to death a rebellious son, which of course then the rabbis say no one ever did, but it's there to teach us a lesson. I think there's a lot of conflict that maybe exists, and I'm not an expert in this, that would have led to that being a problematic commandment to say honor your children, especially because our children, when do you honor them their whole life, you honor, I don't know, but I think it's about the fact that our tradition is about looking back and what's built you to where you are now, and that's the foundation, and then that's what you have to look forward. That's what you need to rely on in order to look forward. So that's my answer on the fly for that, but the great question. Okay, we are past time. Thank you, everyone. As always, I really appreciate all your comments, your questions, your suggestions, your interpretations. Thank you for spending the last hour with me and with each other learning these texts. I hope you have a meaningful Shabbat starting tomorrow night. Quick announcement. Esther alluded to the fact that we're sending out a daily Elul message, a teaching from each of the different clergy each day, during the month of Elul. So you can look out for those either on our website or in the daily emails if you get those. Also, if you're a member of Wilshire Boulevard Temple, we're offering for the 2 weeks, the week before and the week between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we're opening up our sanctuary for 10 minutes for private time in our beautiful sanctuary for anyone who's a member and their family members to come. There will be a clergy person on standby in case you want a blessing, in case you want to engage with other people, or if you just want your 10 minutes of silence and reflection. I remember when I first joined the team last year, to go into that sanctuary when it's empty, which the majority of our members don't have that opportunity to do. Most of the time they go into that sanctuary during the high holidays where there are 1,800 other people there. There's something very powerful about being in that isolation and in that silence and being able to connect. So I want to urge you to sign up. It's in our daily emails, so you can find a way to do it there. So lots of learning opportunities coming up, lots of ways of engaging in the high holiday season. So Shabbat Shalom to all of you. Thank you again, and look forward to learning with you again.